Buen día, buenos días.
Hello and good morning. Welcome. Welcome to all of you here in the room on online, third day of the Men in Movement 5th edition. We're here to rethink the future of masculinities. The first session focuses on bodies, sexualities and affections. I believe this is a very interesting topic that we have been exploring since the beginning of the Men in Movement project back in 2015. Here's a topic that gathers many questions, which from a theoretical perspective are very important, starting by reflecting on the body as a place of cultural production, identities, and the body as a political entity in the broadest possible sense, in the sense that personal is political, how to inhabit the world from a practical sense, body understood as a region for cultural and material as well as symbolic learning. Body as the dynamic body of symbolic learning. So sexuality has always been a cross-cutting topic because we know that sexuality is a negotiation forum, a gender negotiation forum where power is negotiated, what we are, who we are, how we foresee the future of gender relationships and power relationships Sexuality is the area of negotiation of international, negotiation as well as affections. Affections also play a very important part. Affections need to be understood from a relationship-based perspective. Relationships push us forward as human beings. Affections or emotions include a long list of meanings, and it goes hand in hand with thousands of new and not so new theories. But of course, it resonates with the theory of affection, the last theoretical contribution on the field. So there's quite a lot on the table, on our dish, but I would like to say that in this session we are thrilled to count on the participation of John Mercer and Gladys Smith. Thank you very much to both of you for being here. They are two amazing professionals and academics, incredible level, and they contribute to the Masculinity, Sex and Popular Culture Network. Today we're going to be focusing on, their work is based on means, representations and sexuality. Sexualized masculinities, amongst other very important topics. So again, we're placing the body at the heart today, but also we need to reflect about media representation of our bodies. We live in a society where more and more we are actors of an audiovisual production, a never-ending audiovisual production. We are in a very digital and visual world, so it's very important to think about the future in this sense. So I believe their scope, their perspective is going to be very timely in today's session of the Men in Movement. Let me briefly introduce John and Clarissa. John Nasher comes from Birmingham City University. I'm sure you all know his work. He's focused on the cultural construction and gender and sexuality, and he focuses on performance, on how masculinity and masculinities have been, so to speak, performed in a broad sense. He's been carrying out research in the field for more than 20 years, and one of his main aims is to understand representation, sexual representation, and he's carried out research on porn representation of male and the sexualization of culture, and how to negotiate with identity. This is a very short summary of his contributions. Probably he's going to be speaking about the concept saturated masculinities, who knows? And we have Clarissa Smith from the Newcastle North University. They are co-authors in the network Masculinity, Sex and Popular Culture. And they are also co-authors of a book entitled Sexualized Masculinity. Groundbreaking. We know very little about the book, but we can't wait to read it. Clarissa Smith, Northwestern University of Newcastle. I believe we're all willing to read this book, right?
Talk about that shortly.
Right. Anyway.
Her work has focused on the topic of representation and about what happens when the media start dealing with sexuality, pornography, sexualized items and products at the media level, as well as access and regulation. What happens when we want to somehow narrow imagination or regulate imagination? Masculinities is a cross-cutting topic in their work. So, perhaps I would like to start today's session by asking you the following question. How is it that you have decided to focus on this theoretical field? So what brought you at the beginning of your work or during your trajectory. So what question marks did you have inside of you that brought you to research on body, sexuality, and the media? So here's the question.
I will go. Oh gosh, I will go first. That was a little bit loud. Okay. Well, I guess I'd started researching around this area in the early 1990s, which I thought was a period of change. I was seeing change, and one of the things that I was doing an MA at that point in women's studies. I'd returned to university, and much of the theory was about the ways in which women had no interest in viewing men's bodies, unlike men viewing women's bodies. But this was kind of in contradiction to what was going on in popular culture at the time. So, this was a time of, well, certainly in the UK, it was the rise of the Chippendales. We'd had, there were magazines coming out that were aimed at heterosexual women. They were erotic magazines rather than pornographic magazines, but some of them were aimed at a more pornographic sensibility, and it was simply the mismatch really between feminist theories of representation, objectification, sexual desire, and such, and then what was actually happening in popular culture. So that was where I started from, and kind of yeah, it was accidental in some ways, and then has blossomed into a career.
Yeah, sometimes life is the way to show you where to go, right? So
Yes.
accidents maybe
Yeah.
they're a good combination of where your interest is going, and then
Yeah.
gives you some hints.
Yes, I think actually taking shelter from the rain one day in a newsagent and looking along the racks of magazines and just thinking it's really odd that lots of men's faces aimed at women readers, and then also some top shelf magazines which were targeting women, heterosexual women. So this just runs so counter to the theory, that pornography for women is different, that we have no visual interest in men's bodies. It just seemed, like that mismatch was the interesting thing for me.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then, John and I met at a conference, didn't we?
We did.
Yes.
We did. My interest kind of was peaked initially. As I think is the case with most people who end up with an academic career, the things that you end up researching often relate to things that you're trying to work out yourself at some points. And like Clarissa, I kind of started off in the 1990s. And in 1990, I went with my partner to New York for the very first time. And we were staying with our friend Gary, who was out and about on the gay scene. So we were going to the Limelight, we were going to the Roxy, we were going to these, fantastic nightclubs. Mm-hmm. And I was very, very struck as somebody who came from a British provincial city and was used to a gay scene that was very provincial and very heterogeneous in the way in which people presented themselves, the way in which people styled themselves, and heterogeneous in the kind of generations and bodies that were part of that culture. Suddenly you landed in New York in the early 1990s, kind of at the peak of the AIDS pandemic, and you're suddenly encountering these ideals of masculinity, these muscular, incredibly handsome, very body-conscious men. Mm-hmm. And it was a huge kind of paradigm shift in terms of my understanding of what gay culture looked like, how unlike British gay culture it was at that time, and how connected it seemed to me to the iconography of gay porn at that moment. And it was so starkly different to the British experience that it kind of planted itself. The experience planted itself in the back of my head. And a couple of years later, I went to university. Like Clarissa, I went as a mature student in the days when that was still possible in Britain, because we used to get grants to go to university. And I decided that I was going to write my undergraduate thesis about gay porn, because I was a cultural studies student, and we were constantly being told that cultural studies provides us with a framework to analyse whatever we wish. So you can look at any aspect of popular culture because you have a rubric that enables you to look at Shakespeare in exactly the same way as you would soap opera. So I was I guess I had a perverse psychology that made me think, I really want to test the limits of this. So I want to see whether you can use these tools to look at materials that we're really not even supposed to be acknowledging exist. So I decided that I was, in part, it was kind of like a student attention seeking, I think. I'm going to do the thing that's going to mortify my supervisors. My supervisors were incredibly supportive and have always been throughout my career. Through a conversation, I was introduced to Richard Dyer, who at that point, Tom Waugh was writing his big book at that moment, but Richard was really the only person who kind of consistently written about gay porn, so I was very lucky to meet him. And Richard was really supportive as well. You know, these are the kind of crazy old days when a highly regarded and very serious film professor would say yes to the undergraduate. Yes, please come round my house, and I'll spend several hours talking to you, and I'll drive you home as well. He did all of those things. He fed me and drove me home. And on the basis of that, I thought, okay, well, what I'm now going to do is I'm going to do a masters. And I wrote a dissertation also on gay porn. And at this point, I thought, I really want to see how far I can take this, because I think there is something to be said here. So in 1997, I enrolled for a PhD and wrote a PhD about the iconography of gay porn. I think it was a very pretentious PhD, really. It was I was using postmodern theory, particularly Baudrillard. And I kind of invented this very kind of highly theorised edifice to kind of theorise how generic iconography works in porn. I don't think it stands up particularly well anymore. And on the basis of, on the back of that, I got my first teaching job, and I've hung on to this idea that gay porn is something that is really important to talk about. At the point at which I was registered for my PhD, it was a very, very unusual choice to be registered for a PhD about gay porn in a British university. There was quite a lot of anxiety at my university that it would bring the university into disrepute. Yeah. There were kind of various spurious conversations about the ethics of doing this kind of research, but the ethics really was not really about ethics, it was about reputation management for sure. But this was another thing that kind of fueled me, really. I kind of thought, well, if universities are resistant to this idea, we should carry on doing this. And as Clarissa said, 10 years after that, we were both at a conference about men's bodies at Nottingham University. I was standing outside smoking a cigarette when I still used to smoke cigarettes, and Clarissa came out because she was looking for somebody who would give her a free cigarette. and we have been friends and romantically entangled ever since. So it's a long story, but that's really how we find ourselves here.
Thank you for sharing this story. Thank you for really. It's well, of course, always like personal trajectories is intertwined with the academic questions, as you said at the beginning, right? And there is this moment that you have these moments in which something like sparkle in you, like you said, you were there under the rain, and you saw this representation of masculinities and male bodies, maybe prepared for a female audience. There was something new and totally disconnected from the debate that was going on in feminist theory at that time.
Yeah.
And in your case, something similar, right? Like the conversation on gay porn was not happening, at least from theoretical or academic or political perspective. So there is something going. If something is absolutely away from discourse, then it's something relevant, right?
I think both of our experiences have been, was certainly at the start of our careers, that we were kind of like the voices in the wilderness.
Yeah.
And that's how we kind of found each other. That's how we connected with Fiona Atwood as well, because me, Fiona and Clarissa were the people who were writing about porn at that point in Britain.
Yeah. And actually it was the conference that we met at, which was, it was a really interesting conference, but there was an awful lot of what you might term strong theory about men's bodies, in which it was, I think, largely driven at that conference by the focus on art history. Yeah. And there's a kind of sense that, the male body only ever represents kind of nationalistic values, or, the human endeavours. And we were talking about something much more maybe fluid, or I don't want to use the word soft, it seems a bit ridiculous in terms of porn, but, the kind of different sets of bodies with different orientations and inviting different kinds of looks from audiences. And actually, I think I'm as interested in audiences as I am in the representations themselves. But, it's all the stuff that gets left out in those, in some of those discussions that are really quite, focused on proving a particular thing about men's bodies. And we were always slightly off the side saying, oh, but what about, in that, and there was an awful lot of orthodoxy, I think, in the late 80s into the 90s. And actually, the places where the most interesting work might have been being done was in some of the popular culture writings, like Mark Simpson talking about men's bodies was interesting, but also in teenage girls' magazines, there were some really interesting discussions of men, or young men. And I think, there was, we're still living with some of that strong theory now, right? It hasn't gone.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
See, yes, I would like to ask another question, like, going more deeply into the debate. At that point, you said the debate was around objectification of women's body. That was where mostly the discussion was circulating around. And you wanted to, you observed something different happening. In your case, similar. So my question, could you situate a little bit the debate that was dominating at that time, and around the body, around representation and the body, and how it changed through your scholarship or through science?
So, my PhD and my kind of work is kind of located in quite a peculiar place. My PhD is in film and cultural studies, so kind of like two domains of knowledge and their relationship between each other. And certainly in film studies, film and media studies during the early 90s, the debate around men's bodies was really kind of overwhelmingly framed around the idea that the representation of a man's body always carries risks. the risks that it might be read as erotic, and that has to be disavowed at all costs. So there's a whole set of rhetorical twists and turns that filmmakers make to kind of disavow that possibility. And these are kind of theoretical arguments that don't necessarily map onto the history of cinema, because you'll find hundreds and hundreds of examples of ways in which audiences are encouraged to kind of take pleasure from looking at men's bodies. But the orthodox theory was that was largely impossible, and that Hollywood cinema was ostensibly about trying to disavow that possibility. And as a consequence of that, the representation of the male body at specific historical or cultural moments seems to be hysterical. It seems to be overdetermined in some kind of way, because there's so much work being done to compensate for the possibility that the body would be read differently. So this is Steve Neal's masculinity as spectacle, for example, from the very early 1980s, is kind of like a foundational study. Yvonne Tasker's work is about this. Peter Lemon's work is about this. There's a whole body of these scholars, and it's this is useful work in as much as trying to understand or trying to conceptualize the way in which Hollywood narrative cinema structures sexuality and sexual desire, how Hollywood cinema creates conventions, rhetorical conventions. These are interesting ideas, but to extend these ideas to popular culture more generally, and certainly if you want to look at sexual representation, they just weren't very useful ideas, and they always felt, to me at least, like dead-end ideas, because you were constantly just writing off whole swathes of representation, whole groups of bodies and groups of identities as, oh, this is just compensatory. These are just hysterical representations. So that was a problem for me. And what I was trying to do at that point was conceptualize male bodies, particularly gay male bodies, and to try and understand the way in which a gay male body is connected to the making of a gay culture. And I still haven't worked out what that even means as an idea, really. Yeah, that's what I was trying to do. What do you think, Clarissa?
Well, I think you're entirely. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't working with moving image. I was working actually with printed materials, and so the idea of the pin-up had been something that fed into those arguments about objectification and the idea that only women could be objectified in this way, cut up and photographed as if, she is an object. And the thing was that there were these magazines that had come out that featured men represented, shot to highlight aspects of their bodies and to offer an erotic spectacle, and yet the spectacle was not particularly spectacular or fabulous or anything in any meaningful sense. And I was just really interested in the fact that it became very difficult to think how that could be theorized. And, looking at Richard Dyer's work, he wrote a really fantastic article called his looking at You Kid, the instabilities of the male pin-up. Yeah. And he talks about the difficulties that occur in trying to photograph men as sexy, that, once they're no longer, some kind of totem of power, then it starts to be slippy and you can't be sure what the image means. But, these magazines were premised on the idea that there was a possibility to represent male bodies in a way that was sexy. And so it's trying to think about how that might work. And of course, one of the things is that, you know, popular culture, moving image, visual culture, they don't stay still. They're in conversation constantly with the place that they come out of, but also where they're orientated to. And so one of the things that was really clear about the photographs, and certainly when I was talking to members of the editorial team producing those magazines, that they were trying to feel their way to a visual vocabulary of the male body. They were using a lot of their photo shoots were actually they'd been done for gay porn mags, but you know they needed to present something that was more heterosexual. And so, you know, I asked them to talk me through some of their choices about photographs. And so, you know, that was really interesting to think about what were the criteria that they were using to think about what appeals, how does this stop him looking like he might be gay, because that was certainly one of the things that their readers were writing to them about and saying, you know, I don't want a man to look like he might be gay. So others actually writing and saying, I like when men look like they might be gay. So, you know, these are the problems that producers often have, that we don't recognise. We see them as, you know, in a lot of the theoretical writing about production, it's like somehow they're all seeing, all knowing, and they produce these things without any difficulty. But actually, they were feeling their way towards a visual vocabulary and inviting their readers to respond to that. And that kind of made me think more about the ways in which actually representation is dialogic. It's not. It doesn't just. It's not monologic and imposed on people. We're invited to respond, and that response might well be rejection, but it also is, you know, well, I'd rather it looked a bit like this or whatever. And actually, you know, the idea of what was sexy in 1994, when these magazines first came out, has completely changed, right? Looking back at those magazines now and thinking about how pop stars and film stars and others are represented, there's such a difference between, you know, this kind of quite slightly embarrassed sort of representations with what there is now, which is much more kind of, well, cocksure and yeah, I shouldn't say that, should I? But, you know, that just has a sense of actually established vocabularies, really. I suppose that's the thing. So, yeah, it's 30 years.
Simultaneously established vocabularies and established vernacular as well.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
yeah.
like, I often think there's a moral philosopher at Birmingham University called Heather Widdows, and she wrote a book about 3 years ago now called The Perfect Me. And her book is entirely about women in the beauty industry, and the way in which her thesis is that increasingly over time, beauty has become a moral imperative. So it's tied into women's sense of themselves and sense of purpose in the world. And what that's meant under kind of neoliberal conditions, although she doesn't use that rubric to describe what she's talking about, is that what used to be good enough isn't good enough anymore. So the bar for what's acceptable beauty over the past kind of 20 to 30 years has got higher and higher and higher. So having a chipped tooth, for example, in the past would have been okay. Now it's not okay. To have an occasional blemish used to be okay. It's not okay anymore. Yeah, and it's always struck me that although Heather was only writing about the female beauty industry and writing about the experience of women, that in actual fact her argument applies just as much, in some cases even more, to young men and what an acceptable body looks like now is certainly not the same body that it was when I was 25. The kind of representations that we see now are not the same. The kind of ideal body that we see now is not the same body that it was 25 years ago. So yeah, Clarissa's right. The idea that, and one of the problems I think with masculinity theory sometimes is that that masculinity research is very emphatic and very invested in really kind of fixed notions that don't necessarily reflect people's lived realities, and certainly don't reflect the contemporary moment in the, you know, I don't think hegemonic masculinity as a concept has the same purchase that it had in the mid-1980s when Connell wrote the book. But so many people still invest in it, and at the very least, there needs to be a radical revision of those ideas rather than the constant reiteration. It's kind of like the discourse is hegemonic as well, you know.
Picking up on that, indeed, I think this concept served a purpose at that time.
Sure.
Concepts emerge from practice and theoretical practice and do serve purposes. Yeah. And they are dialogical and negotiated in conversation with questions, practices, and encounters, right? Yeah. Physical encounters. Absolutely. Even. Indeed, fixing concepts, it doesn't serve any purpose. It doesn't give justice neither to reality nor to dynamic theorizing about reality. Yeah. Yes, and I agree with you, John, when you say that maybe it's a sign of the hegemony of discourse, of academic discourse, or in a way to anchor your work to a concept that maybe give you some space, right?
I think there's work to be done and thinking to be done. And this was one of the conversations that emerged from our symposium. Was it last week? It feels like it was 100 years ago, but it was last week. Is masculinity theory, masculinity studies, investment in the idea of the categorical and how important the categorical is. And I say that as somebody who has spent most of his career looking at categories in gay porn, categories in Hollywood cinema. But there is something about the nature of masculinity theory that people are really invested in the idea that here is this new category of masculinity that we need to kind of account for or theorise in some kind of way. I'm quite sure I shall continue doing that. But, you know, I think our symposium was an occasion for reflection for me. That's where I took that.
I was there at the opening, and I observed the conversation.
Jonathan was fantastic, wasn't it? He really was.
Yeah. So from this, I would like to ask then, what are the ideas, the moving ideas, the vibrant ideas that, according to you both, can help us understanding the situation we live in nowadays, to understand, to observe, to keep this curious gaze at representation, masculinity and sexualized culture. So if you could pick up, let's say, 3 or 4 items.
Okay. This is an occasion for us to talk about our book. There has been long in gestation. When we originally, I hope nobody from Routledge is listening to this conversation. When we originally wrote our proposal, the proposal seemed to be as clear as crystal. It seemed to be very practical. We can break what we want to say down into 8 chapters. We agreed that they were the right ones. We were largely organising ourselves along lines of genre and modes of communication, I think. And then we both said, yes, let's start writing this. And I said, I'll write the introduction. This is really oversharing, but I'm going to carry on. I'm going to carry on now. I've started. I'll write the introduction. And writing the introduction, I thought, should draw together a little overview. Well, not a little, an overview of the kinds of domains of knowledge, the theoretical frameworks that we're going to draw on. And it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more complicated. And it started to make me think, oh, I'm not certain this is the book we thought we were going to write. And then we stopped for a long time, didn't we? Because we didn't really know where we were going to go, because the structure that we'd written just didn't seem to reflect the materials that we were speaking to. So the book is about the way in which men's bodies are sexualized, for want of a better term. So a lot of the terms that we were using have also become very freighted and complicated terms for us. So what do we mean when we're talking about sexualization? Because we're not accepting sexualization as a category in the way in which the term is used in Britain at least, which is kind of like equivalent to objectification. That isn't what we're talking about.
In Spain it's the same. So
Yeah.
if you could actually elaborate on what you mean by sexualization, that would be great.
If I knew, I would. I think that's what the book is trying to work through.
Okay, so
But I think
Yeah.
that's an indication of some of the ways in which it's not just in academia that there's a kind of hegemonic categories being established. You know, some of the terms that we use for thinking about masculinity are incredibly political, right? And the idea of and objectification as a term is now being incredibly politicized, so that, you know, there's an expectation really when you go to policy events, or if you're at anything where there are politicians who are talking, they will talk about objectification of women and girls, and then the concomitant kind of activities that men are engaging in is the objectification of women and girls. And so actually sexualization as well is another term, as you say, it now is kind of linked to objectification and is entirely really focused on the idea of too much too soon, that it's a bad thing for people. Whereas, you know, maybe, 15 years ago, sexualization, there were maybe 3 different ways in which sexualization might have been used. One was it just marks the transition between being a child or being a teenager and being an adult, that, you know, your sexual organs develop, it's a developmental stage. A coming to awareness as well as another way. And then there's this kind of idea that has really taken hold and kind of sedimented as a sort of political idea of sexualization as something over the top, an irrepressible force. It's imposed on young people, male and female, but with very distinct pathways for male children and female children. So, you know, it's just a problem to use that term, to be thinking about it, especially as it, in some ways, the terminology now means that you've got no movement within it to be talking about different aspects of sexualized masculinities, right? Which is, there is, of course, a very particular format that's used by Hollywood and by some mainstream TV, but then there's also, you know, what's termed the soft boys of Netflix and the kind of explorations of sexuality that are much more labile, fluid, kind of have a more inquiring sense about them, and they're not generic in the kind of ordinary way that we might have thought about with action versus, you know, sitcom or whatever. So it's kind of, and we are having to kind of go through lots of different theoretical trajectories that I think we thought we were just going to be able to dismiss quite quickly in our thinking.
I wish the book wasn't called Sexualized Masculinity.
Well, we can change the title if you want.
I'm increasingly thinking that we should change the title. I think in terms of organisation of the material now, I think increasingly we're thinking about, I'm saying we're thinking about, I'm thinking about, and Clarissa may
We'll
agree.
have to just go along with it.
Clarissa may have a different thought. I think we're organising the book around modalities or orientations. Yeah. So there are kind of contemporary phenomena, but phenomena isn't the right word either. There are contemporary modalities that I think are very specific to now and are interesting things to think about. So everybody who knows me is sick of hearing me talking about how interesting thirst trapping is. I'm obsessed with the idea of thirst trapping, and thirst trapping is a relatively contemporary phenomenon. The root of thirst trapping, the root of sharing images of your beautiful body to kind of titillate people isn't new in and of itself, but the platforms through which and the ease of circulation of that material and the sheer volume of that material means that something qualitatively and quantitatively significant really is happening. So for me, that's one of the things that we're talking about. The connections between men, masculinities, male bodies, and the beauty industry is one of the things that we're really interested in. The idea of the Hollywood body is another thing that I'm particularly interested in, and the international circulation of the Hollywood body. I've been speaking to one of my colleagues who's a Bollywood film specialist, and he's kind of suggesting to me that what I'm calling the Hollywood body is also the Bollywood body increasingly. So the kind of the international circulation and distribution of sexualized masculinities, in inverted commas, I think is an interesting thing. I think it's increasingly become it was already important to us that what we were not going to write about was just white, Anglophone, popular culture, but that has become increasingly more and more important, and that the book can't be about that and that alone, and it isn't, is it? No. What am I missing, Clarissa?
No, I think that's. Well, I think we've been through a number of iterations, haven't we, of, or at least listing of things that we would like to look at, and I think there's a whole range of alternatives to the kind of Hollywood male that we might want to look at as well, like K-pop and its influence, and queer cultures, non-binary presentations, the ways in which those the filtering through actually from more marginal representations to the mainstream that we see, and how that gets taken up and then reflected back, and it's there's a lot. That's great.
It's a lot, indeed. Yeah, you were right.
Yeah, and it's working out what actually contributes to a coherent argument, really. That there's such a lot that we could be including, that we have to be, I think we are now really coming around to the idea that we've got to start slashing some of those ideas that we thought about in the first place.
And also, does there need to be an argument? Does there need to be...
Well, maybe there needs to be a number of different arguments, doesn't it? But they still need to have some coherence.
Yeah.
Well, you said, John, that all of this is significant. I think this is the main argument. The meta-argument might be that one.
Yeah.
All these items and significantly happening, and they need to be looked at.
Yeah, and I also think there's something to say about the the circulation of materials through social media that needs to be spoken, needs to be thought through and theorised in its own terms. So kind of using a framework borrowed from film studies or media studies doesn't necessarily work. Sorry.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an adaptation of ideas from media and cultural studies.
Yes. Exactly. I wanted to go in that direction, as you said, like social media, and I think you mentioned it, right? The overall circulation of images and all range of audiovisual material that is happening. And actually people are not just passive public. We are both at the same time producer and receiver of material, right? So what happens, well, you mentioned the case of intimate and images or products where there is a lot of erotic investment for personal use or shared. This is like common practice, and there is huge qualitative and quantitative considerable thinking to do that. So the next question for me would be like, indeed, how the debate is what do we do, right? When it's not just thinking with audience, public, and the viewer, right? So it's per se, it's a dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to recognise that the digital space has offered a very different way for thinking about how people might engage and live their lives digitally, right? That actually, especially for younger people, they're not talking about the difference between on and offline selves.
Exactly.
You know, it's the same, right? That the digital is a place in which they are themselves, right? And I think we've got to recognise that, and how that gives opportunities for playfulness and ways of being different in different spaces. And I know that a lot of the kind of political movement is around that idea of, oh, but, you know, this will have impacts for later and consequences for later. So, you know, the idea of risk. But actually for younger people, and I mean some older people as well, there's a real sense that actually the rewards of taking those risks are really worth doing, right? And a lot of that is about representing oneself as sexy, fashionable, all kinds of different ways of being. And I think that there's the fact that those representations are in the hands of individuals rather than that they belong only to a relatively small number of people just really changes how we might think of representation. That it's no longer about, you know, one or two images of men that come to stand in for all men, but that actually there's much more going on than that. So,
there are quite big ontological implications to that as well, I think, in terms of rethinking ideas of intimacy, rethinking ideas of the distinction between the public and the private. And I think I think for me that's the one that has the most purchase and is the most interesting. That this idea of what is private and shared with the few and the special becomes something that is shared with anybody who wants to gain access, and this idea that the aggregation of this mass of material and the kinds of algorithmic implications of that means there's kind of a construction or a reconstruction of the body, I think, or a meta construction of sexual desire and sexual desirability that is populated by people uploading their material, you know. So Instagram you know, there are a whole set of problematic questions around ownership and the future of this kind of material. But it strikes me that Instagram is this fascinating archive that has been built up over time, and that for future historians of sex and sexuality and people who are doing that research now, these are really, really valuable resources, because you can see en masse the way in which people choose to represent themselves, choose to represent their sexualities, choose to think about their bodies. There are all sorts of untapped resources, I think.
Definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not going to add to that.
One last pop-up question, and we open the floor for more debate. If you could choose one question for nowadays, the representation world, what is the politics? What is the politics of representation? What does it mean to look at this politically?
That bodies matter, that bodies are the material that shapes our identity, that forms our sense of ourselves and our sense of other people as sexual objects, or sites of our libidinal investments, that bodies are sources of power, that bodies are sources of meaning-making and investments.
Yeah.
That's, I think,
It's enough.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah.
I always feel very resistant when people kind of, and you know, it would be both of our experience, I think, that people have often thought, well, ask the question, why do you want to research this kind of material, John? Why do you want to research this kind of material, Clarissa? It strikes me that this is as important as anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing, oversharing, and go along with the conversation and inspire us with your ideas. We open the floor for questions. Yes, Begonia, second row.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this beautiful chat. I wanted to comment on something, and then I wanted to ask something, to hear your opinion on it. And that I know it's going to be very difficult, but I want to listen to you on this. Go to Spanish. A ver, en los 90, cuando yo hacía mi tesis doctoral sobre... Oh, you prefer me talking in English? Okay, okay.
No.
In the 90s, when I was preparing my doctoral dissertation on gay men in Valencia, I watched all the gay porn I've watched in my life.
Yeah.
Almost. I've been watching gay porn due to different reasons, but I have the impression that then the images were just the ideals to desire, but not the body to become. You know, so in the, but that's my impression. That's why I want to hear your opinion about that. You know, people were watching these images or these bodies as an ideal.
Yeah.
But it was quite unthinkable they could become that body. And I have the impression now But for some years now, and due to different technologies, due to the importance of bodies, to the increase in importance of male bodies and the objectification by everything you've been commented today, there's a different relationship to visuals and to images, because they're no longer ideals to desire. They're that you want to be, you know? So I would like to hear your comments on these, and then I would love to hear your impressions on, given that, and if that is so, or you think there's been this kind of movement, you know, between subject and object image. The fly who always accompanies our interventions during this conference. Where do you think now bodies start and bodies end? I know, but I want to hear you on this, you know, because there's this flow between the material, right, and the limits of the material, which are not scheme, as we know, and the ideal and the representation and the flows between subject and object. So I would love to hear you on this.
It's a dialectic, I think, obviously.
Thank you.
As it happens, there's a sense in which we could speak to this, but Jamie Hakim is in the room, and Jamie wrote a book on this subject. So there's a sense in which Jamie is better to speak to this, really.
I will talk to Jamie later.
I was going to say, come and have the mic, Jamie, and answer the question. Well, Jamie's argument, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the conditions of neoliberalism mean that young men use their body, realize themselves through their body, because their body has value, symbolic and economic value to them. So investing in your body, making the most of your body, realizing your body in phallic terms, for want of a better expression, is part of the process of neoliberalism. Would that be a fair summation, Jamie?
Yes.
Hold on a minute, because you're not using the microphone, people are...
Of course, yeah. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, no, John, that's exactly right. In the UK, during a certain period, it's not just the prevalence of neoliberalism, but specifically neoliberalism after 2008. Sorry, I'm caffeinated. And the conditions of austerity specifically mean that young men who used to be able to rely on a certain sense of stability, a certain income, a certain guaranteed kind of job for life sort of thing, that doesn't exist in the UK. Certainly, and so they invest in their bodies as a way to feel valuable when all the other historical forms of value they've relied on. And of course, digital media gives them the means to do this in the way that the panel were talking about before. And it's something I'd be interested to hear about, certainly in the Spanish context, because obviously you experienced austerity in a very particular, perhaps more pronounced way. So I wonder if the similar sort of trends were happening here. There you go.
And if you haven't read Jamie's book, Work That Body, you really ought to read it, because it is excellence. It's politically very important, and it's certainly in terms of me and Clarissa thinking about the framework for our book, there's a sense in which our book is sort of a response to the things that Jamie wrote about a couple of years ago now. What else is there to say on the subject? I certainly think there's I think your argument is right. However, my experience isn't that that's a universal relationship to porn. the reason that I started writing about this stuff in the early 1990s was because you went to the clubs of Manhattan, the fashionable clubs of Manhattan, and what you saw were men who were already then, at a very specific moment and for very specific reasons, i.e. the AIDS pandemic, and wanting to look as healthy as you could possibly look. But that phenomenon had embedded itself within gay culture in the early 1990s in America. It took a long time to travel over the Atlantic and come to Britain, but I think it is here now. Jamie wrote another essay about the idea of the spornosexual, so this idea of being interested in a sporting body and a porn body at the same time. And that really has become part of British popular culture. And I know that it is also part of Spanish popular culture. You know, young men's bodies in a Spanish context have always been accessible to Spanish people in a way that they have not been to British people. When you live in a hot country and you go to the beach and you see people's bodies, that's very different to a Northern European context in which we're not ever supposed to see anybody's body unless we're married to them. So there really is a sense in which those things are nuanced slightly differently. But I think where we've got to now is kind of, I can certainly look at Spanish popular culture and it's very recognizable to me. It's kind of, it's dynamic and exciting and quite surprising in different ways to British popular culture, but it's really recognizable. Clarissa?
I think I was going to answer your earlier comment, but I'm not sure that I've understood it now, because as people have been talking, but you said something about the ways in which 1990s porn was encouraging forms of design, ideals, was that right? And
I'm not that interested in learning about the differences between 1990s porn and today's. I am more interested in learning about the limits of the bodies and where we consider now, due to this change in the relation between image and body and ideals and expectations, where how can we talk about a body and where do we consider that the body starts and ends? Because bodies now include, due to this change of relation between object and subject, bodies now include a lot of things that are not really our skin or muscles. So I want to hear your impressions on these. If you have any, I mean, you may say, I don't know, that's perfectly okay.
I don't know.
Thank you.
I mean, I think it is interesting to think about where does the body begin and end, and whether or not we have a clear sense about our own bodies, right? I mean, there's the ways in which you might feel sexy and not look sexy, right? So which is that moment, or vice versa? It's difficult. I mean, that you might look unwell but feel well, that you might, all of those different things, or imagine yourself as a particular kind of person, but understand that you're being related to as something else, right? I mean, I don't know that we have a pure sense of ourselves, do we? And the ways in which others might want to impose particular meanings on you. I mean, we see that. Well, it's one of the things that we talk about in another book that we did manage to finish, probably because we're writing with other people, which is on objectification and, the kind of imposition from the outside of meaning onto particular bodies moving in particular ways. And I don't know. I don't have a particularly good answer to, well, I don't have an indifferent answer either to that. I just think that there are a lot of very interesting things that we could be talking about, and about the ways in which, you know, our bodily experiences don't have to be observable to other people, right? In some ways, I mean, Merleau-Ponty talks about the pleasure in movement, and anybody who's ever kind of got lost in a dance can understand that feeling without having to have the perfect body for dancing, right? I mean, it's, yeah, and there is a pleasure in bodies, different levels of pleasure in bodies, including their desirability, but, you know, yeah, the fact that they work, the fact that they don't, I don't know, yeah. So I feel like I'm just talking around in circles there, but yeah, it's probably something that needs proper working out on paper, yeah. It's great.
Yes, we have 2 questions. Who was first?
Hi. Should I give it on? Okay. Thank you both that was very helpful, and also, you know, in providing a context for your own research. My question is about the place of the fields and disciplines of masculinity studies and porn studies in the present. Because in my perception, it's probably fair to say, with a strong tradition of cultural studies in the UK, or the UK being actually the birthplace of cultural studies, you have it institutionalized to an extent in a way that other European countries may have not, for example, Germany, where I'm coming from. And also certain, say, dynamics and developments within the fields of gender studies and queer studies have changed quite dramatically over the past 20 years. I mean, masculinity studies was never part of gender studies to the extent that gender studies was examining positions of femininity. And more recent queer studies has actually moved away from, say, its you know, ancient core business of gender and sexuality studies. So I guess I'm just curious what your perspective on this is. So is masculinity studies still a part of queer studies? Is it a field that's beyond? Is that a good development? Is that productive for masculinity studies to have a different framework than queer studies? Or how do you see that constellation?
Well, I'll talk a bit about the idea of gender studies, really, I guess. Certainly when I was doing my women's studies MA, which was gender studies. They've all gone now. You know, there was a brief moment where they burned brightly in the UK, women's studies programs, and then some morphed into gender studies, but many of them just disappeared. And the tendency was there to talk about the fact that we talk or we research all the time around men, so what else did we need to know, you know, that history is male-centric, etc. The thing is that none of that really investigated kind of, I mean, it's the great men of history and it's the great men of science and not really the very ordinary, everyday, quotidian kind of ideas around masculinity. And I think that is something that has started to emerge. But I think for me, personally, I do feel like there's a lot of really exciting work being done around gay masculinities or queer masculinities, and not very much around heterosexuality or heterosexual masculinities. That just seems to stay in this same place of, well, examining toxic masculinity, for example, or trying to demonstrate that no longer, you know, that young people are doing things differently. And I don't know, is my answer. I mean, I think it's difficult now in the era of, well, certainly in the UK, I could never imagine cultural studies being born again in the UK. Now, we are not in the same context as we might have been in 1970, and the kind of idea that we would be investigating ordinary elements of culture has kind of, you know, unless it gets bums on seats, it's not of interest to the university hierarchy. So, yeah, that sounds despondent. I didn't mean to, but anyway, I think there is some really exciting work going on, but there's also great big areas that are marginalised or not addressed at all.
I think the kind of boundary marking that happens as a result of fields of study cohering can end up with people finding themselves in very funny places. And I think that's what's happened with masculinity studies. I think masculinity studies finds itself in an unusual place and has kind of backed itself in, often feels to me at least as if the arguments can't move on because there is such an investment as almost articles of faith in specific theoretical formulations, which mean that no progress can be made. It strikes me that one of the routes through, or the helpful routes through for masculinity studies, has been a dialogue with queer theory and queer studies, because what queer studies offers, there is the most valuable thing I think that queer studies offers is a critique of normal and the normativity. And that's the route through which, for me, you look at masculinity, you interrogate masculinity as a way of thinking through the way in which our knowledge of the world and our knowledge of what is regarded as normal, so the normative, is something we can critically engage with and ask critical questions of. I mean, you know, I think in both of our cases, me and Clarissa have always been researchers who don't have a natural home in any one discipline. Although I've taught film studies for the majority of my career, I don't use the kind of methods of analysis that most film studies scholars would use. I'm a media studies theorist, but in actual fact I don't use the kind of methods that media studies people have used. I've been able to teach on visual culture courses, I've been able to teach in lots of places because the kind of the methods and bodies of knowledge I draw from are kind of here, there and everywhere. And that was, for me at least, what the beauty of cultural studies, that you could be Catholic, that you could grab a bit of this and a bit of that. Some people would also argue that that was the weakness of British cultural studies.
Yeah. Agreed.
Si tenemos otra pregunta.
I believe there's another question.
This very interesting dialogue. I just got a bit hooked on two developments that you talked about. The one thing, this multiplication of authorship in social media, Instagram and so on, and the other development, this tightening of the bars of what acceptable beauty is, I think you called it. I like that phrase very much. And I was wondering if you could kind of put these two developments together or kind of reflect on how they might intermingle or how they might work with each other. Because I think that's interesting that this big dreams about the democratization of representation that was once projected onto online media seems to have kind of taken a very different turn somewhere.
The thing that I'm particularly interested in at the moment, so as our research network comes to an end, I'm slowly putting together the idea for the next piece of research that I'm going to do. And this is research about middle-aged men's bodies, particularly middle-aged gay men's bodies. And social media is the place, well, one of the places that I'm going to be looking. Peter over here is going to be collaborating on this piece of research. And the reason to do that, for me, the reason to look at social media is that social media offers a space in which lots of different categories of generation, of ethnicity, of sexual interest can exist. But what happens en masse is kind of like a leveling out, a refinement of a set. You know, it's hard not to use words that are borrowed from other disciplines. Generic norms, a vernacular starts to emerge, and an idealized vernacular for the most part. So what I'm particularly interested in is looking at what the idealized vernacular of middle-aged gay men's bodies looks like. I think there is something to say simultaneously about that the ideal isn't a homogeneous, unitary, single ideal that you can map out over generation, race, ethnicity, class. But within these categories, you can see this kind of vernacular form emerging where there is a level of standardization. I haven't worked out whether that's true or not, or whether it even matters. I'm not even certain it even matters. It's kind of interesting. And that's kind of the sort of direction that my research has always gone. I'll go with what I'm interested in and then try and work out why I'm interested in it. That's a good enough reason to do anything, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, if we're talking about future, I am very much interested in the idea of digital intimacies and what young people are doing online and how that may be altering the sense of what it means to be intimate online. And I mean intimate in a really expansive way, which is not just about, you know, kind of romantic relationships, but can be about all sorts of things. And also how that then impacts on the ways that they engage with representations of each other. And I think there's a lot of talk about what young people are doing online and how they're posting and what they're doing with it. And yet, actually, we're not really engaging with their practices or understanding. When we rarely ask young people what it is that they think they're doing. We just talk about it in terms of needing protection or prohibitions, or, you know. So, yeah, I'm not sure that answered your question, but I kind of followed on from where John had led, I guess. But again, I like him, I am interested in the things that interest me, just sort of kind of, that's a bit of a challenge, what might that mean? And then following that through, so yeah.
We have one more question.
I want to pick up, thank you. I want to pick up from the point that John made, but in relation to Clarissa as well, that kind of 1970s cultural studies work is no longer imaginable in the current context. And your comment that so much of what is dealt with heterosexual masculinity as in relation to queer studies, positioning it as the heteronormative. And I wanted to kind of, which posits it as a kind of a bad object to begin with, which already, I think, eliminates a whole areas of analysis. So if masculinities are social, discursive, ideological constructs that we all fail at and struggle with, and that are changing, and that there are current digital manifestations of that are very interesting, one of the things that we see that is very interesting is, I don't know, what those kids that don't have sex and kill women, right? And yeah, so actually there are entire areas of heterosexual masculinities that are not necessarily heteronormative, that are part of a struggle that risk not being analyzed if we are reliant on queer theory to make sense of it. Yeah. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, yes. There are whole areas. The problem is that there are disciplines that have really taken up questions of masculinity. For example, psychology, and, you know, with quite questionable means of investigating what masculinity might mean to people. And I think that is I don't know, you know, so it starts from the idea of what are the problems of masculinity rather than, you know, how do people experience it? And it's quite, I don't quite know how to articulate this for myself, but it always seems to come down to, in the end, some kind of negative finding that means that now we have to work on these masculine subjects who are doing terrible things, even if those terrible things are quite smallish in there. And yet there's no kind of understanding of why might they be interested in that. I mean, I think that's what's interesting about Jamie's work, is that taking the idea of neoliberalism, a problematic, and seeing how it works out in terms of individuals, but not then condemning those individuals, but recognizing what might be the, you know, the ambivalences of the things that they're doing, right? You know, so they're both good and bad, or, you know, they're neither. And I think that's really important. It's part of the problem, I think, about some of the categories that we use to describe masculinity and how they become kind of articles of faith, is that idea that we have to explain everything, and in order to do that as researchers, there shouldn't be any ambivalence. It is, right? Here's the norm and everybody's conforming to it, or, you know, they're not. That's spectacularly, you know, challenging it or whatever. But actually, maybe theory needs to be a bit more messy, which might be where queer comes in, because of all those ideas around messiness and failure and stuff. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, where do I go? I don't know.
I think, yeah. I think the important thing to hold on to is that masculinity is more complicated and more various than the masculinity studies account might suggest. Not because masculinity studies is in denial of that, but more to do with the fact the set of research questions that masculinity researchers have chosen to investigate and what they have chosen as their objects of study. Yeah. So the heterogeneous, the various, the unusual have not been their objects of study, their investments. I think in large part, you know, because the masculinity studies has always had an uneasy relationship with the men's movement. And I think if you dig underneath a lot of masculinities research, it's about having an investment in the idea that there is an authentic masculinity, really. That we can get to this thing, there is an authentic masculinity. And that's very, very different to feminism. You know, that's profoundly different to feminism. Feminism asks questions about what the nature is of being a woman, but it also ostensibly asks questions about the social and cultural construction of femininity, whereas it seems to me often masculinity research is about finding the authentic masculinity underneath all of this stuff, because there is a real masculinity, there is a singular, universal masculinity, and I don't believe there is.
Yeah, well, I mean, in some ways, it does feel like there are aspects of feminism that are turning to that particular point of view. And I do actually think that feminism plays its own role in that kind of creation of an idea of the essence of masculinity. And of course, part of that is, you know, there are problems with some men, right? And I don't want to be the person who now says, not all men, but, you know, there are very real political, I mean, with a small p, kind of ideas about masculinity that need to be urgent issues there. But somehow that kind of gets transposed onto thinking about much more expansive ideas of men and masculinity. So, yeah, it's a difficult one.
Yeah, I would say that the I would say that the two issues that you mentioned are not mutually exclusive,
No.
luckily.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. But I think also it may well be partly the ways in which our kind of public culture operates is about trying to pit different groupings or different ideas about research as if they are oppositional always, right? And so it's kind of like it's adversarial. So there are two. Either masculinity is toxic or it's not, and you know the average good person will eventually find they need to listen to both sides, and then they'll find their perspective that they'll come to some in between way. But actually, I mean, I think John's repeated it a number of times, and now I'm going to. It's more complex.
More complex than that. We leave it there. It's more complex than that. It's messy.
Yeah, I think that's...
And we are working on it.
Yeah.
They're telling me that the time is
out.
And let's celebrate the end of this session. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Buenos días.
Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to the second session. A critical regard from Ibero-American masculinities. The aim of today's session, or the reason why we have included the topic, is because we have a concern ever since our beginning, which is including other narratives into the debate on masculinities, a debate that has been widely dominated by Anglo-Saxon culture and production, and we have always been interested in engaging these other regards. In other editions, we have been discussing about Southern masculinities, Southern European masculinities, and even North African masculinities. We had a speaker from Morocco in a previous edition who referred about masculinities in sub-Saharan Africa. Today we wanted to bring on board Latin American voices in order to open a debate between academic production and activism. We're going to be focusing today on academic production and work with men and interventions in plural with men. That's why we wanted to include the Latin American debate, the Latin American experience, and compare such experiences with the experiences in the Iberian Peninsula. We count on the participation of three guests, three speakers. To my right, Juanjo Compaire is a secondary school teacher. He's now retired. He's an expert in co-education. He's the coordinator of the book Boys and Girls in Relationship, Masculinities for Secondary Education. He's engaged in the movement Men for Equality since 2001, so it's been a while. And he's also the promoter of several men's groups in Catalonia. He's a member of ILG since 2004, and he's the co-founder of the section Egalitarian Men. He was its first president since 2009. He is a researcher on the movement's history. He published the book Men and Gender, published by the Institute of Social Sciences. He's also part of the Insubmission movement, where he presented a conference in the Ibero-American Conference on Men and Equality on the topic. To my left, Leonel Sebastián Delgado. He is part of Men Against Patriarchy. He's a master's. He holds a master's in public policies by University of Zaragoza, and he's now developing his PhD here in Barcelona. He's a member of the group GRIT for Urban Transformation. He's also a member of the Masculinities Observatory, and he leads the project Men Against Patriarchy. He is published in several reviews. He has also published books on sociology, and beyond being a researcher, he's a disseminator and a trainer in sociology of relationships. For quite a long time, he has led a debate forum entitled Eros Fault, where he's published several articles on sexuality, love, and he's in charge of the blog Masculinities in Demolition. Other articles such as Fucking Around, amongst many other interesting things. On the other side of the Atlantic, from Bogota, Javier Omar, it's 5 o'clock in the morning in Bogota, so rather early. Thank you for waking up so early for us. What a pity you can't be here. It's not his fault, or neither COVID's fault. It's due to the racist policies that have been raised. Javier Omar is part of the movement Men and Masculinities in Colombia. He holds a BA in philosophy by Medellin University. He has 2 postgraduate diplomas by San Marcos University in Peru. He's specialized in social administration. He's a social educator in Colombia, co-founder of the group Men and Masculinities 1994 in Bogota. He's been part of several projects with public entities and international cooperation projects, as well as several articles in the field of critical masculinities. Well, the context has been set. Thank you to the 3 of you for being here. The idea this morning or this afternoon is to open a discussion about this critical regard that we should and might have about masculinities and work with men both in Spain and in Latin America. We aim at bringing on board new regards that oftentimes go undermined in academic circles, especially in the Western countries, in this very ethnocentric academic circle in which we're all trapped. So to start, I would like you to perhaps tell us a little bit more about what motivated you to develop your interest in masculinities, both from a research perspective, from an activism perspective, etc. And tell us a little bit more about the relationship between, well, when you develop your interest for the topic, in what contexts did you start working in Spain and in Latin America? How were things back then in terms of masculinity, studies, work with men? So what was the context back then, and why do you, let's start with you, Juanjo. Sure, thank you, and hi Javier, dear friend and colleague. How are you? We've shared several debates and articles together, so it's a pleasure to be with you, even if it's online. Thank you very much for waking up so early in the morning, for being with us online, because as Paco already said, the goal today is learning from you, dear colleagues in Latin America. I believe that today Latin America is the hotspot in the movement of men for equality at the global level, or at least that's my opinion. So this is the goal today. And now, in order to answer to Paco's question, well, first of all, I shall start by thanking you for inviting me. It's not so frequent for me to be invited in academic conferences. Oftentimes, academic conferences are closed to activism. In this sense, Men in Movement is an exception, a fortunate exception. Nonetheless, one of the main problems or challenges that we face today in the movement, I believe, is the mismatch between academic research and activism. So going back to the question, Paco, what inspired me personally to get engaged in the field? We need to bear in mind that we're speaking about a period when, well, at a personal level, and I believe here I have the same experience than many men that started getting closer to the topic back then, I was feeling uneven. Well, let's remember that there was the book by Marquez, an article that was somehow pioneering, entitled The Alienation of Men, 1978. So back then, there was some sort of movement and the masculine unevenness started to be on the debate. There were therapy groups, etc. The first contact that I had with the movement was in Barcelona. So this unevenness went hand in hand with the rise of the feminist movement after Franco's death, and also a rise of the gay movement. Back then it was called gay movement, not LGBTI movement. And there was also the rise of insubmission movements. So there was we were amidst a political transition here in Spain. The first transition stage had already been finished, and there was some sort of political disenchantment. There was an urgent need to do politics through different platforms, different from political parties, and I believe these are the basis of the movement. I did not participate in the movement at the beginning, but at the end of the 90s, and especially at the beginning of the 21st century, the whole movement crystallized in the Jerez conference and other initiatives. I would like to underline, well, I have already said that I was feeling uneven. I will go back to this later. And of course, the impact that feminism had on me and the LGBTIQ movement had on me and the anti-military movement. Well, I would like to underline that violence against women, the case of Ana Orantes, which was the trigger of an awareness raising, a collective awareness raising, an important awareness raising on the topic of violence against women. Then there was also the fact that there was a first political project in Jerez, my town. The City Council of Jerez decided to launch a men's program in 1999. So I believe that we'll revisit this point throughout history. I believe there has been a certain institutional support to men's movement, but it's been a personal support, not well structured, except for some exceptions, like the Basque country's example. But in the rest of the country, political support or institutional support depended on the personality and the political will of individuals. In the case of Euskadi, there was a lehendakari, a president, who gained interest in the topic, but it was quite distructured. The movement was highly messy. The case of Jerez is quite symptomatic. Pedro Pacheco, the mayor of Jerez, back then decided to set or found this first institution within the Department of Health of the City Council of Jerez. So the health department came up with an initiative that has been continued afterwards, which debated about paternity, egalitarian fatherhood in the school of Jerez. So little by little, more and more items were raised. And I would like to underline a point here. In the Jerez conference in 2001, in which I participated, and for the first time I got acquainted with other men interested by the topic, and that, well, they were also feeling uneven like I was back then. So in the Jerez conference, entitled Men Before the Challenge of Equality in 2001, as I said before, or perhaps it is not well known, but there was a first presentation in the conference which was crazy, highly emotional, by a trans man. This person, this man, considered himself an XX man, and well, even back then in 2001, there was a certain opening towards the topic of transsexuality, and I want to underline this point because I believe that ever since the beginning, the men's movement has been, let's say, open to including trans men within the movement. Having said that, I would like to say that the situation back then was the following. We had a group of experts with a committee, Mr. Bonino, Lario, José Langel, well, a long list of experts who were somehow in charge of the movement, who led the movement. Then, of course, they had very little institutional support, a clear lack of financial resources. There was also an heterodox platform, with a certain repercussion at the media level. I recall in 2003 here in CCCV, the first workshop on masculinities took place. That was 18 years ago, and near 2004, the second workshop took place also here in CCCB. So there was like an initial interest on the topic by academic sectors. So in that context, AIGE was founded in 2001. I joined in 2003, and this was the, well, this is the context. And I'm going to leave it here, otherwise I will talk forever. But I would like to insist on the importance of the openness of the movement to trans men. Well, it's very interesting what you mentioned about how unevenness brought a group of men to ask about their own masculinity. Javier, tell us a little bit more from your perspective. We would like to know first, what was your motivation to develop your interest on masculinities and start your work on the field, and how this personal interest coincides with the context and the rise in Latin America, which I believe is previous, on the movement of men for equality and the scope and work on masculinities. Wait, Javier, we can't hear you. Let's see, we can hear you now. Yeah, I was muted, my apologies. I still don't manage Zoom well. Hello, Juan. It's a pleasure to meet you all here online. So, I started getting close to masculinities about 1982. I read a text by a Boston group of women on an experience that they had in Boston. It seems like in Boston they were quite hippie, and for me it was amazing because I felt as a hippie. So when I read the text, I found it extremely powerful because it raised personal questions in terms of masculinity, my own masculinity. I read the text, but back then I didn't find who to work with here in Colombia. I am from Antioquia, Medellin, and unfortunately Medellin is well known for violence, drug trafficking, etc. Violence, yeah. So we live in a context with a high degree of gender violence. So for me, the question raised was very important. Is there any other way to behave myself? For me, it was highly inspiring. A few months after, and by chance, I read a book by Mitchell Hoffman, and there I found a tip for reflection. I found food for thought on the topic of violence. So I started digging in. At the beginning it was just a personal process. I kept reading and reading to see how I could exert my masculinity in a different way, how I could interact with my partner, and how I could become a father. When I became a father, of course, the question or the topic of changing practices gained a lot of stamina in me at a personal level. Now, in the Latin American context, we're speaking about the 80s and the 90s, right? So, from a social perspective, there was quite a lot going on. Neoliberalism started a harsh deployment in Latin America as well as in the rest of the world, of course, and it depressed and precarized individuals' quality of life, and this, of course, turned into the development of revolutionary movements in Latin America in general and in Colombia in particular. And I refer to Latin America because, of course, all the revolutionary waves reached Latin America. Cuba had a long previous experience, but of course Cuba was also a key player in this revolutionary wave in the 80s and 90s. Nicaragua, El Salvador, Chile, Argentina, and the fight against dictatorships in these two countries. So throughout Latin American history, I believe that there is a clear idea that things are not right the way they are. And this is nothing new, right? But of course, revolutionary movements were an interesting channel to raise important questions and to open a debate and to see that change is possible and that another world is possible. And I believe that was quite fundamental. So this is the context that allowed men to start thinking about the possibility of changing things. And the question was, to what extent can we carry out a personal change process at the political level? Of course, then there were many conferences on women topics, El Cairo Conference, Beijing's conference, Oparam in 94, in 1979, a Convention for the Eradication of All Forms of Violence Against Women was approved by the United Nations in 1981 in Bogota. The first feminist Latin American encounter took place, and I believe this event marked a change, and ever since, November the 25th was to be considered a day against violence against women. So in 1988, several conferences had took place in Chile, focusing on men's responsibility in their exercise of health, sexual and reproductive health, So there's, on the one hand, the social side of things, but then there was the activist movement, the women's activist groups, the gay movement, which was not called LGBTI back then, but started, opening new fights and struggles in the streets, etc. And of course, I believe this was a perfect context to start working on new masculinities in the 90s in Bolivia. For example, there's Sistac with Jimmy Telleria, and Sistac in 1998 started to launching a big question, Coriac in Mexico with Figueroa, with Garcia, etc. in 1993, started pushing forward in Mexico. In Colombia, we started in 1994, 27 years ago. We have never stopped, right? There's quite a lot of stamina and willingness to push the movement forward. So in Chile, there's another group of men, Por Otro, called. In Argentina, there are a few groups called Men Against Capitalism and Patriarchate. In Costa Rica, the OBEM Institute. In Brazil, Pro Mundo, which has enlightened the field in Latin America. In Cuba, in 2008, a network on new masculinities was founded. So in all Latin American countries, there were already initiatives on new masculinities. So this is a clear proof of the approachment between academic movements and activist organizations. We need to quote Aguayo, Marco de las Indias, Jimmy Telleria in Bolivia, Figueroa, Estoro Garcia, and Alfredo Cruz in Mexico, Álvaro Campos in Costa Rica, Iván García in Colombia, Hugo Uberman in Argentina, Manuel Ramos in Peru, and so on and so forth. So little by little, new initiatives, new reflection initiatives were founded. We're speaking about groups that meet, work together, etc. And I'm going to leave it here. Thank you very much. Lionel represents the youth, the young generations. So we would like to know what inspired you to gain interest on these topics and what was the environment you found back then. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for having invited me. I believe that these forums are extremely valuable and they are an excellent opportunity to network. So, of course, how we started. Oftentimes we look at the origin of things to reproduce it. And the answer tends to be around three main topics or reasons: empathy and closeness. Empathy, sympathy, and closeness. Empathy, in the sense that, as Juanjo said, there's this unevenness. I experience my own unevenness in my case. I am a young migrant with a difficult history. I've had some bullying experiences in my country of origin. I'm oversharing, I know, but I have some food problems. I have experienced food problems in the past. Personal acceptance issues. Sexual problems, relationships with my own gender, other genders which are related with bullying and sociability. So of course all this produced a forum for reflection focused on pain and unevenness, and I believe this is a very interesting forum to come up with interesting learnings and lessons learned. When I realized that all my life I've been reflecting about gender without knowing, I thought, hey, this is my topic. When I was a child, I reflected about my dick, about being fatty, about why do I like better to be with girls than with boys. So after a few years, when I had the theoretical tools, I realized that I had been reflecting about gender for all my life without even knowing. Now regarding sympathy, I've been very lucky because I've been always surrounded by women that have taught me a lot and have supported me and helped me at all levels. And this has allowed me to channel my pain, to channel my evenness, and to start developing an interest for gender topics and better understanding the world in which we live, learning from others, listening to close women speaking about harassment and the violence they experience on a daily basis in their everyday life, such as in a club or when they walk back home, etc. So, not to speak about the lack of commitment of several men. And I thought, wow, me and my brother, we were dispensed of helping at home, whereas my sister had to do all the work at home. So these feminine narratives around me also allowed me to develop my interest in gender topics in a painful way, because listening to women speaking about never-ending pain and harassment is hard. I had to face the fact that I had been a bully, I had harassed other women without even knowing. Last but not least, empathy and solidarity. I said solidarity. I've been very lucky to be part from the very beginning of my life of certain activism groups. Since my childhood, I've been engaged in environmental protection movements, youth social movements. I am a member of the 15M movement, which channels so many political concerns. And as a result of that, this pain, this unevenness, little by little gained a political scope with a long list of concepts and ideas that frame my experience in a political environment. And I believe that these are the keys that allow me to deal with my own pain and unevenness. I believe that this framework that I have described marks the difference between a frustrated man and potentially violent compared to a committed man, committed with equality. So, yeah, thank you. I would like to elaborate about the situation today. This workshop on the Men in Movement has referred to the need for more intersectionality both at the academic level and at the activism level, because there is no doubt that what we know today is that the movement is a white middle-class men movement. So there's a lack of generational turnover, so to speak. And I would like you to dig into the topic as well as the impact that the movement is having in Spain and in Latin America, because the feeling that I have sometimes is that we are not capable of having a deep impact in our respective societies. Why is it that the movement is not capable of mainstreaming? Perhaps it's difficult to answer, but I would like to hear from you. How do you perceive this matter here in the Iberian Peninsula, and then we'll hand it over to Javier for his views on Latin America. Who would like to start? So when it comes to masculinity studies, I said before that I have the feeling that sometimes they are disconnected from the everyday life, from the movement, the little movement, as we call it, composed by few people with a very slow growth, with a big head and a tiny body. The head of the movement is represented by the fact that, and well, I'm just going to share an example with you, but of course we could list many other examples. We have more and more audience at the academic level, even at the Miguel Hernández University. There is now a postgraduate diploma on masculinities, and in Latin America the same applies. This has existed for quite a long time, so there's more and more academic weight in the field, an incipient support at the institutional level, but the body is weak, almost rachitic in terms of membership. But of course the membership is little by little growing. The composition is very homogeneous in terms of age and even academic background. I would say those from the social sectors are prevalent. We need more doctors, scientists, engineers. Other perspectives, other approaches are badly needed in the field. So there is no doubt that there's a mismatch, not to speak about the cultural origin or the ethnic origin. The movement is limited. It's been very difficult to bring on board people with different ethnic groups. We've tried in Homes Igualitaris to work with migrants, refugees, but it becomes complicated. It is complicated. There is a cultural element which is difficult to overcome sometimes. And that's why I am very much interested in getting to learn about the experience in Colombia, because in Colombia they have a very diverse membership. They have been capable of being in the political agenda, even in a context of warfare with an indigenous population that has been historically ill-treated. And it's incredible how they have been capable of engaging with the indigenous peoples and being part of the political agenda in the country. I don't know if you've seen the picture of the young Colombian boys naked in the center of Bogota with a clear sign: all men for peace, none for war. This social mobilization capacity is lacking here in Spain, so I can't wait to hear from the Colombian experience. Lionel, I'm going to ask you the same question, and perhaps something else. You are quite critical with the concept of new masculinities, in the sense that new good men can end up becoming hegemonic, like a new form of hegemony. So tell us a little bit more about how you see things today. Where do we stand today from an academic production perspective and from a more, let's say, grassroots movement perspective? Do you believe the concept of new masculinities could end up becoming hegemonic? Regarding the national structure, I agree that there's a major problem, which is that we are mainly represented by white middle-class men, and of course adults. But as Josep Maria says, or said, we're far too represented by the middle-aged white men and middle class. This has to do with the fact that, of course, it's a matter of class. Social classes that have time to invest in other things but working, and then it's also related to the national structure of academic research. It's very difficult to be a young researcher in Spain. It's very difficult to be part of the national production system. Then there's a traditional colonialism in academic production. It's very difficult to escape it. It's very difficult to produce in Spanish because quotes are far too invaded by English. So the structures are very complex. And as a result of that, there is a mismatch between the academia and some topics that might interest the youth. This is quite ironic and sad that never before there's been such a virtual and physical mobilization on masculinities, and the fact that there is such a mismatch between academia and activist groups. I know it's a little bit unfair, but, well, likes on Instagram are not being an activist, but the interactions in Instagram and Facebook are never translated into real physical mobilization. The virtual mobilization is very intense, but the physical mobilization is rather weak and poor. That means that these gatherings do not raise interest amongst youth or old people. I have been a member of work groups that end up dying due to a lack of interest or commitment. It's very difficult to engage with the youth today, I believe, and this clashes with the political interest in the area of violence prevention and the work with young men and boys. Oftentimes, political or projects are rather limited, not sustainable over time. Trainings last for a couple of hours. There's a clear lack of continuity. Yes, there is a certain political interest, but they do not end up crystallizing in a training strong stream. Hopefully, little by little, it will be grounded. The title, in Universidad Miguel Hernández and in Complutense University, there will be a PhD program, and we should also speak about the masters Jose Maria mentioned yesterday in Castilla-La Mancha University. So there is a clear academic brand that little by little is being implemented, and perhaps this might end up turning into the development of a canon regarding masculinity, studies and practical steps. The postgraduate diploma of the Complutense University is focused on social action, so it aims at developing a certain canon or coherence in the implementation of public policies and training programs. Of course, this goes hand in hand with challenges and risks, such as the resurgence of new hegemonies regarding the ideas that inspire militant groups and masculinity narratives that will translate into voices that will become mainstream regarding key topics, delicate topics such as sex workers, trans issues, pornography, sexuality, etc., or the lack of fundamental topics that should be raised, such as eco-feminism, that is absent of all theoretical frameworks on masculinity, when it's an urgent topic to discuss related to the climate emergency. And let me conclude by referring to the idea of new masculinities. I am totally critical regarding the concept of new masculinities. I'm totally pessimistic, sociologically speaking. I believe that more than an hegemony of new masculinities, there are new hegemonic masculinities that teach us how ridiculous or useless or precarious it becomes to theorize on hegemonic masculinities. We thought there was such thing as hegemonic masculinities, when in fact there isn't. It has shit has hit the fan, and we now realize that the concept is extremely changing. The hegemonic masculinities that we theorized about during the 80s are pointless. Today we're closer to the hegemonization of hybrid masculinities, combining strange things such as Zetangana, Bambani, but also Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish PM. So there's a long list of contradictory elements that prove how difficult it is to use such theoretical tools in a gender analysis. So let me leave it here. Javier, tell us a little bit more from the Latin American side. How are things going there today? You have, of course, many countries to refer to. So tell us a little bit more about the academic production on the Men for Equality movement reality. I would like to underline that men groups in Latin America are the result of two triggers. On the one hand, due to women, so at the shadow of feminist groups, or at the shadow of NGOs, feminist NGOs, or feminist institutions that enabled some room for this work with men. So this is one stream that has to be underlined. And this is part of the compound. Then there's another area that allowed this work, and that is men work per se, like our group. So we meet to debate about our own concerns, motivations, out of our need to speak about ourselves. Not like women asked us to do it, but rather because it came out of our own interest, and this is important. And this means that also in Latin America, we are combining our approaches in terms of activities implementation. I will dig in a few minutes. Now, secondly, new masculinities. I believe that masculinities, and now this has to do with intersectionality, the questions about new masculinities has to do with questions about living conditions, men's living conditions. And you know, the question of who am I as a man, this is very much related to the Eurocentric approach stemming from the Greeks. Who am I, being or not being, etc. So in Latin America, the key question from a philosophical perspective has to do with something that defines the Latin American philosophy. The peasants movement, the indigenous peoples movement, the Afro-descendant movement. So status matters. When I ask myself about status, I am asking myself about my gender condition, my social positionment, my racial framework, etc. So there, two interesting fields open up. Well, perhaps more, but I'm going to refer to two. So from what approach? Well, there's a liberal approach in which the key problem is patriarchy as a system, because it's considered that patriarchy works per se and is functional per se and for se. So, patriarchy is considered the origin of our pain as men, and we focus all our work in our struggle against patriarchy. But this is limited to anti-patriarchal work, right? This does not mean that we do not take into account other key elements, but the focus is the struggle against patriarchy and the change in interpersonal relationships between men and women, between men through intimate or intimate processes regarding masculinity. And there, many of the coaching work on masculinity has been inspired. There are more and more coaching movements to develop new masculinities. That's why the political struggle, or the political management rather than struggle, is very important to reposition within the state forums public policies for segmented populations. We need to implement public policies for targeted populations. So, it's not about the LGBTIQ community raising a claim so that there is a specific claim within the lesbians also need to raise their concerns. So things are segmented. Population becomes siloed. And of course, this is extremely positive for capitalism and neoliberalism. Divide and win. It does not mean that each specific struggle should not take place, of course, but within a more holistic political regard, a more intersectional political regard. So this would be the liberal approach. The enemy is patriarchy, point. And then there's another pattern that has been, well, this approach is called complex, with no family name. It's a more holistic approach in which patriarchy is not considered like a single thing, but rather a symbiotic parasitarian system, parasitarian to capitalism and neoliberalism and colonialism, of course. So patriarchy would gather different strands, and that's why we speak about a colonial capitalist patriarchy, because patriarchy per se means nothing from this perspective. So the struggle is oriented to developing a holistic perspective about the definition of patriarchy, because the question, when it comes about men, has not only to do with their gender, but also it has to do with their political positionment, their social origin, their cultural background, their ethnic origin, the skin, the color of their skin, their sexual orientation, their gender expression, whether they live in the city or in the countryside, their age, etc. So questions become more and more complex. We need to be capable of widening the scope. Last, and regarding categories, It has been raised by Lionel before. Now, from our perspective in the group, we like to be eclectic in terms of categories. We stem from the idea that academic categories or social categories are not sufficient to understand complex realities. Such categories are dynamic, like societies. So we are not interested in categorizing. We like combining all categories, new masculinities, freeing masculinities, alternative masculinities, etc., especially because we aim at understanding how they interact at the social level. So if the entry door is to rethink about one's masculinity, we welcome this, because it's precisely there in this holistic approach that we can move things forward. We need to define how reflection happens in a certain social environment. This is the only way to implement actions within certain categories, because of course some working groups evolve, all of them evolve, and perhaps they start using a concept and then they switch to another. So indeed, it's very interesting to take this holistic approach and to allow things to flow. Say we start working with a group of men where the question they ask themselves has to do with violence against women. So let's speak about non-violent masculinities. This will be the perfect entry door. And if we can move things forward, and if this group ends up being articulated at a political level, perfect. We'll speak about liberating masculinities. So I believe that we need to allow debates to be complex. We need to allow any entry door. We need to accept any entry door to change. And the same applies to the academic sector. In Latin America, there's a permanent question on pedagogy, methodology. And from this perspective, bodily work, that I will speak about later, is very important. So, thank you. Thank you for your comments. I believe it's a very interesting topic. And I would like you to dig in perhaps a little bit about the contributions from the Southern epistemology to the feminist global production. So, especially regarding the heterogeneous cosmovisions, such as the indigenous people's cosmovision. So, to what extent do they contribute to feminisms and feminist production? When in 2019 I had the opportunity to travel to Bogota, you talked to me about the concept of buen vivir, the good life, which somehow has been included in the methodology, right? In the feminist methodology and the work on masculinities. I don't know if you could tell us a little bit more about the good living and to what extent this good living can pose a lesson to be learned. Thank you. So down the line I was following before regarding the different scopes, the liberal scope or the complex or alternative or holistic scope. There we find ourselves in the process of working with communities in the field work, etc. We little by little realize that men, it's not enough to ask yourself if you are a good man, if you don't hit your wife or are violent. No, we need to go beyond. We need to think about social order mechanisms and oppression means. So reading the situation from Latin America and the social movements, the political social movements, social political movements, etc., and the ones to be founded right in Colombia, because there have always been a lot of social movements in Colombia. So we found in this proposal of good life, Buen Vivir, the indigenous proposal, it's not a concept, it's a political proposal, it's a political manifesto based on placing human beings at the center. I believe the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that the COVID-19 has smashed down political systems. The pandemic is laying on the table the main features of capitalistic systems, especially in Latin America, where the precarization of life is terrible. During the pandemic, all the system collapsed. The system that we had somehow bought collapsed, as the case in Chile. In Chile, they invented a whole story about the Chilean successful neoliberal model that collapsed right away and has shown what it hid. So, what are the alternatives? We need to think not only about gender, but also about the whole system, the social system. We need to think about civilization on which we have developed our lives, and little by little we need to go back to the original reflection. It's a very contemporary reflection, because when the indigenous peoples march the streets, when the first line of students is accompanied by the indigenous movement in Colombia, when the Mapuche movement is raised in Chile to claim itself and to participate in the Constitutional Assembly, well, it means that it's an original thinking, but yet extremely contemporary, because it entails allowing the possibility to rethink the world from with different logics. So the very same concept of good life or buen vivir has to do with a cosmovision, a political proposal based on the global south epistemology. In Spain there's also a global south, and you are also part of the global south movement, a critical approach on the domination systems. And in Africa also there's a global south movement, and in Latin America we have called the movement the good life process. What are the key principles of the movement? One, it's radically different from the capitalist movement. According to these logics, everything is interrelated, and that's why there cannot be patriarchy, but rather a planet, the Pachamama that... No. Everything has to be articulated with the big compound. Everything is interrelated. This is the first principle. Secondly, the rest brings us to reflect about holisticness. I love this concept. It is a principle that allows us to think about life holistically, not only in an integral way, like if it was an addition of items. The word holistic has a Greek origin, but in Latin America we like to speak about completeness, because completeness is really rich in meaning. Then there's another important category in the good life movement based on the idea of us being a community of beings, human beings, but also other living beings. So it turns out that I cannot be part of an exploitation exercise against other beings. Extractivism needs to be brought to an end. It cannot be our development mode, and that's why the proposal is radically different. And then, of course, there's the Ubuntu in Africa. I am because we are. This is the basis of Ubuntu in Africa, and we support the idea of nosotros in Spanish, yoas or mías in English, mías, the combination between the me and the us. So it's all about think me as against the sovereign, individual, Eurocentric subject, the subject of the sovereign me, the individualistic individuality. Of course, we're not denying individuality, but individuality happens in articulation with others. So this opens the field to rethink ourselves in a much more complete way. Also, everything in life is diverse, and thanks to diversity, life is possible. Nature, biodiversity. This means that the political vet for diversity and for human lives has room in this way of thinking. Then there's another element that needs to be considered. The universe operates on the basis of masculine and feminine, but it's not assigned to specific bodies. The logics of masculine and feminine as key forces that move the world and the nature is important. And it's not a binary logics, but rather a dual logics. In the indigenous cosmovision, there's the concept of double duality, which means basically that the movement is always in the search for harmony, balance, reciprocity, and correspondence as key principles, as foundational values that allow you to think the world different. This would mean that men feel reciprocity with women, so to speak, and with the world in general. So, development models need to be updated, and men of all theaters and forms and origins and women of all types feel called to respect these principles. Now, to summarize it, the theory of the good life has to do with enlightening the everyday life and to launch basic statements such as knowing how to speak. Knowing how to speak is key because we need to use specific words to denounce things, knowing how to think from where we think. Yesterday we had a debate, an online male encounter in which we reflected about knowing how to love and how to be loved. This means that men are challenged. We need to think about what romantic love means. I love with control. I love that I want to possess. How do I let myself be loved? What is loved, etc. Knowing how to celebrate. When we celebrate and we drink, we know we need to celebrate. Of course we need to celebrate. How do men celebrate? How do women celebrate? We need to reflect about all these items. In Cuzco, we were reflecting with the Quechua-speaking population about how to sleep, knowing how to sleep. And one said, well, I sleep well. Well, but how do you sleep? How many hours a day do men sleep? How many hours a day do women sleep? Why do women have to wake up early in the morning to cook or to take care of their children? So how do we even share the bed? Many women told us that oftentimes men do the whole men spreading thing because it seems like the street is masculine, the bed is masculine, so the whole men spreading, whereas women are left in a little narrow part of the bed, right? So the good life, el buen vivir, is about questioning everything. And I believe that this was not designed from the basis of alternative masculinities. We just added the whole question about masculinities, and I think I'm going to leave it here. Thank you. Thank you very much. A very interesting presentation. Lionel, Juanjo. So how do you react to that? How do you think we could include the good life perspective, the buen vivir, into our realities? Or, well, just say whatever you want. Wow, I guess, like you all, I'm thrilled. I'm just enchanted about Javier's explanation. I had already heard it, but it really touches me. Just wow, I want that for me. So let me go back to the initial topic that Lionel and myself were thinking about our own pain. How, from the man's movement side, do we listen to the pain in other men without necessarily taking a victimist perspective or a revenge perspective? No, let's make it a transformation political tool, a cultural transformation political tool that Javier mentioned. It's clear that there's pain amongst men. It's clear that we need to activate it in men. We need to turn all this energy into a political transformation tool. And this is the question, the key question that I have in my head. I mean, well, these and many others. Speaking about good life or buen vivir, men have a terrible life in general. So, knowing how to live, right, is very important. Yeah, let me go back to Juanjo's perspective on pain. I believe that this is one of the main challenges we face. Recent political history and the resurgence of the neo-fascist waves that we are experiencing today has to do with these dynamics, and I believe it proves our failure when it comes to dealing with these forms of pain. Of course, here we are traveling between two positionments. On the one hand, the failure, the clear, tangible failure of alternative masculinities that have used this pain to set up groups. Perhaps I'm going to sound like a hater, but groups of men. A friend of mine called it the pack of wolves that lick each other's wounds, right? So how not to be self-indulgent? Like, you know, these men that hug each other and say, yeah, don't worry, it's okay, you'll be fine. So perhaps such groups have been overrated. They've had a clear political significance, and now many feminist groups are trying to smash down these groups. And they're right, because we have failed. Many men have been part of these men's groups, but they have not made the most of it. They have just used these groups to redefine power relationships without a bad will, let's say, right? It's not about saying, oh, we need to go back to patriarchy and redefine patriarchy, probably just that we are chaotic and we don't know where to go. And it's easier for us to be trapped in self-indulgent processes than changing, for sure, right? Or for good, because it's very painful to change, I know. I've experienced that. So this is one of the areas in which we are, let's say, poor. The other trap would be to be trapped in a highly political structured narrative with friends and enemies, and where masculinity is toxic per se, and all men carry the guilt from their very beginning, because there's no such thing as equality in a patriarchal society, and thus there's no salvation for men. So we need to be responsible of violence in our DNA, so any form of sexuality that we experience is violent and control-based. So I believe this has been overrated. I always say that it's very difficult to do politics with a PhD, but also with a leaflet. So sometimes we don't find the sweet spot. We tend to try and convince through academic arguments, and we fail dramatically. But the other way around is also true. Sometimes we try and dig into the wounds with a, let's say, leaflet-based logics. And both are valid, but they have limitations. So we need to accept it. Now, I believe this is a key point, and I believe that this brings me to the importance of being critic and self-critical. It's not about understanding masculinity as something toxic per se. No, of course not. We need to dig into the structural responses. All men engage like soldiers of a patriarchal system, and we're going to kill for this patriarchal system. That's not necessarily true. It's not about renewing the domination axis, right? But perhaps there is a lack of, part of the production we have, and the political production we have, in terms of dissemination, perhaps we are lacking a pain-based perspective. In a hybridization in the gray colors in real life. I don't know who's black or white here, but the majority of us are gray, I would say. So I believe that digging into these objective reasons, I'm gonna close with this. It's an argument that I cannot forget in the last few days. Well, we tend to see masculinity as something we need to get free of, and not as a resource. Masculinity can be a resource for self-affirmation. Masculinity can be a resource within many other resources that helps us develop our identity and our self. Cornell used to say that masculinity re-edition processes entail a risk of gender vertigen, because at the end of the day it's about channeling risks and putting yourself at risk. It's about dissolving your personality and putting it on the edge, and this is of course violent. If you are asked to reconstruct yourself, when you are asked to destroy your masculinity, you're being told to face a process of personality reconstruction without being offered resources. Just that you're told, well, think about your privilege, but we have no resources to do so. So let's be also caring with men to redefine our sexuality, our positioning in the world, our emotional self, relationships, the way we speak, the way we live. So, and I'm gonna leave it here. And of course, I want to be now a little bit of a hater. It's sometimes interesting to see many of us who are rich, who have rich lives, and we have a life in which we can, hold on several identities, such as, art, or my success in social networks, or my friends' support network, and I dare telling other guys that they need to get rid of one of the little things they can stick on. The less resources you have at the social level, the more important it becomes to attach to your gender idea, right? And sometimes people who are, many of us, disseminators or trainers or researchers, we are not in a terribly precarious material situation compared to many of the men we research about. So there is a border, or there is a clear gap between both groups. Wow, now I'm empty. Critical views and tools to reconstruct ourselves. So we have 15 minutes left only, so we're going to be opening the floor for Q&A, comments, perspectives. Here's a question.
Bueno, hola, muchas gracias.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the dialogue. It's very interesting indeed. Yesterday we had a discussion about to what extent a society in crisis, masculinity is reinforced and men tend to make the most of their masculine identity to reinforce themselves. And we tend to think that in Latin America, human development is a little bit more in crisis than here. But if we compare the networks here in Spain and the networks in Latin America, it's incredible how developed and deployed such networks are. And I would like to know, how do you explain that beyond the fact that when we speak about social movements and when Javier, well, spoke about how things work in Colombia, I had the feeling, as Lionel says, that there is a hybridization process in the sense that there is a clear focus on the cost, but we tend to forget about feminism and the interminglement between feminism and other movements. I think it's interesting to work on desire, on how to become better men, but sometimes I have the feeling that if we skip, well, in the social networks, sometimes I consider the Latino community tends to develop groups of men that somehow reject feminism and somehow boost self-help or self-support groups. Javier, I think this one is for you. Good. So, in Latin America and in other parts of the world, there are different gender perspectives, of course, and gender networks. In Latin America, for quite a long time now, there are feminist patterns which are quite focused on the Latin American region. Francesca Gargallo, you can find her, Francesca Gargallo. So Francesca speaks or has an interesting perspective on 600 forms of feminism in Latin America. She calls it Via Ayala, which is America before it was conquered. So the Cuna peoples in Panama called America Cuna. So Francesca Gargallo carries out an analysis about the different forms of feminism in Latin America, and she underlines the colonization of the European bourgeois feminism that has had a terrible or an important impact on our region, especially due to academia, which is highly Eurocentric. So there is a dialogue also in the men's movement, and in our specific case in Colombia, even though we have an emblematic feminist group, and we have an excellent relationship with them, there is mutual respect, but some feminisms, some younger feminisms, well, we haven't interacted well with because they exclude men from their debates. Let me give you an example on the point. On March the 8th, a couple of years ago, a proposal, some women said, we don't want men in our demonstrations. We don't want to see men in our demonstrations. Traditionally, we had participated in the demonstrations, but for some reason, they decided that they don't wanted any men or trans women because they said these are men, or they had a penis, or they had a penis. But that same very day, we had been invited by 4 or 5 organizations of women that wanted to meet with us on March the 8th to debate between men and women and discuss about their fundamental claims. So of course there are different forms of interaction with feminist organizations in Latin America, and we respect them all. Of course, there's what we call the 4th feminist wave in Latin America, in Argentina and in Chile. We're speaking about the green movement with a wide social mobilization, with a cross-cutting point between feminisms. It's been an interesting encounter. In Colombia, it has not been very successful for several reasons. Violence is one of the reasons, right? I would like to say also that in the framework of these social mobilizations, we've had a direct interaction with many men, many groups of men, and I believe it's very interesting to work with youth, for example, to better understand what it means for a young man to be in the first row, in the first line, when, I don't know, fighting against the police to claim for a specific right. And many young men in Bogota are part of the working group on the topic, also in Cali, because of course it's very interesting to understand what it means for a man to place his body before the police, what it means to be an alternative man, let's say, to face the police, to throw stones at the police, to defend their political rights. So I believe that there are many, many interesting questions that we need to raise and lay on the table in this transformation process. So I would like to dig in regarding what Jordi mentioned before, and I would like to bring the debate or the discussion back to Spain for a second. I agree with Jordi in his analysis. Sometimes it's quite contradictory to see how virtual activism is crazy in Latin America, but little by little there's this new way of understanding masculinities which is detached from feminism, and as Javier mentioned, this is probably due to some form of anti-men rage, which is legitimate. I'm not saying it's not legitimate, but not always constructive, and some traditions now are being detached from feminism as a result of that also, of course. This is quite an incredible thing, because what's happening here in Spain also is that on the one hand there's this pain that we have been speaking about, and now there are some new forms of approaching masculinity, which is, I don't know how to put it, it's some form of a politicization reflecting about masculinity on the basis of the difference or the dichotomy between men and women, what's feminine and what's masculine, even some esoteric forms or essentialism forms of reflection, independently on whether I like it or not. What concerns me is the depoliticization process that we're experiencing. Let me give you a specific example. It's quite confusing. This is very much related to masculine coaching, which is gaining a lot of stamina here in Spain because it's easy to buy and consume than our narrative or our work, which sounds impossible and boring and confusing. So this masculine coaching simplifies things down. They don't even... Oh, the case I wanted to refer has to do with an organization called Hombres Evolucionantes, which is gaining force in Spain. The coach, the mentor, is a former Yahoo worker who went to Tibet to discover himself and carry out a yoga training and a spirituality training, and then he comes back to Spain to find himself with his masculine essence and reconnect with the true sexuality, tantra, and he did a melting pot of certain philosophies with a very Eurocentric approach and colonial approach. Well, terrible. So, in the website of Hombres Evolucionantes, there's no reference, no single reference to feminism And now it's a big movement for masculinity reflection, totally detached from political transformation and from the connection between gender and political struggles. It's some form of personal illumination. Let me give you a spoiler. It doesn't work, because if you go to these encounters, the encounter is a group of men, because of course it's rather expensive, right? So they're all white, with normative bodies, with no disability, etc. So there's no heterogeneity in these encounters. And in theory, this is meant to be the change, the source of change. So I believe it's extremely dangerous to allow such mechanism to gain so much stamina. Whereas groups like, well, we should ask ourselves, why are these groups so successful from a marketing perspective? Perhaps we should go down this line. They know how to channel specific interests. The same applies to Gestalt therapy, and it's very expensive, and there's no reflection or feminist reflection or criticism. It's personal work, well-being, etc. So perhaps there's something we should ask ourselves. Why is it that we cannot reach men? Of course, I believe there's a clear danger of being self-focused in men's groups. Oftentimes, of course, these man groups allow for greater, they enhance support, but they end up not becoming transformative. I believe there's another problem, another potential problem, which has to do with turning new masculinities in some form of brand. Of course, we are in a neoliberal society, as it has been said many times already, as Javier already mentioned, and there's this temptation, right? There are some public personalities that are well acknowledged. They are called to all conferences. I'm not give you any name. And there is also a group of foundations and organizations that carry out professional work, and I believe this is very important. But at the same time, in an interview that I did to Roberto Garda in the AIG magazine, you can check it if you're interested, he warned us about this problem. He's founder of Men for Equality in Mexico, and he referred to the problem, to the potential problem of turning the research on masculinities, especially when you put the label of new masculinities, which are not even that new actually. So yeah, and the danger of turning them into a brand, like any other brand. And I believe this is definitely a challenge or a risk that we face, making a new marketing product out of the narrative on new masculinities. And I just wanted to warn about this because there is this potential danger. I believe it's out there. We have 1 minute left, literally. Well, new masculinities, I agree with you. Nonetheless, when you interact with people who are not in this field, well, many people understand what new masculinities are about. A critical revisitation, an alternative form of expressing one's masculinity, etc. Well, yeah, it's a brand, but if people understand it, perhaps it's not so bad. It's also about communication, isn't it? A while ago I attended a workshop with police officers, and at the beginning we spoke about masculinities, and they were like freaking out. They were like, oh my god, what is this guy gonna talk about? But when I said new masculinities, they completely understood it. Oh, new paternities, new ways of being a man. I know it's not the best option, but hey, little by little. Okay, we're gonna leave it here. Thank you very much to all of you. Javier, thanks for waking up so early, and thanks for being here. I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you, Lionel, and thank you, Juanjo, and thank you to all of you. Bye-bye.
Gracias a ustedes. Muchísimas gracias. Muchas gracias.
you.